All right, let's go.
Number 11. Physicalism. Consciousness is entirely the brain. Physicalism is also called materialism. It is the dominant position among most working neuroscientists today. It holds that consciousness is wholly physical, nothing more. Conscious experience is just certain configurations of brain matter, neurons firing in specific patterns, no additional substance, no separate ingredient, no extra layer required. The feeling of seeing red under this view simply is a brain state. Nothing more needs to be added. Physicalism does not claim consciousness is easy to explain. It claims that a complete physical description of your brain would be a complete description of consciousness, even if neuroscience is nowhere near finishing that description yet. Most theories on this list operate inside this framework. They are all trying to identify which physical processes actually produce experience. The challenge is the hard problem itself. A perfect map of every neuron firing in your brain right now would tell you what is happening. It would not tell you why any of it feels like anything at all, instead of just happening silently, with nobody home.
Number 10. Global Workspace Theory. Consciousness is a spotlight. Psychologist Bernard Bars proposed this theory in 1988. Neuroscientist Stanislaus Dehaene later developed it further. The brain contains many specialized processes: vision, hearing, memory, language. Each one runs in parallel, mostly unconscious, mostly invisible to you. Consciousness happens when one piece of information wins. It wins a competition for attention. Then it gets broadcast widely across the brain through something called the global workspace, a functional hub. It distributes the winning information everywhere at once: memory, decision-making, speech. Information that loses the competition stays unconscious, processed, never broadcast, never shared with the rest of the system. Brain imaging supports this. When something becomes consciously perceived, researchers see a sudden burst of activity spread wide across the cortex. That burst is missing when the same information gets processed unconsciously. Critics say this explains access, how information becomes reportable. It does not explain feeling, why the broadcast comes with an experience attached, instead of just being very effective, completely unfelt information routing.
Number 9. Integrated information theory. Consciousness is a measurable quantity. Neuroscientist Giulio Tononi developed this theory in the early 2000s. Christoph Koch later helped refine it. This theory does not ask which brain regions matter. It asks a different question. What mathematical property does a system need to be conscious at all? The answer is called phi, a number. It measures integrated information. A system is conscious to the degree it has two things at once: high differentiation, meaning many distinguishable possible states, and high integration, meaning those states cannot be broken apart without losing something. This connects to real clinical data. Phi calculated from brain activity drops sharply during deep sleep. It drops during general anesthesia, exactly when subjective experience seems to vanish. Then it rises again on waking. Here is the controversial part. The theory does not limit consciousness to brains. Any sufficiently integrated system, in principle, gets some non-zero amount of consciousness. Philosopher David Chalmers has pointed out this basically turns the theory into a scientific path toward panpsychism, an idea covered later in this list. Critics argue integration might be necessary for consciousness, without being sufficient. Meeting the math does not guarantee anyone is actually home. Number 8. Higher order theories. You are conscious because you know that you know. This theory makes one core claim. A mental state becomes conscious only when the brain builds a second representation about the first one, a thought about the thought. Simply processing visual information is not enough. The brain has to register that it is seeing something. It has to monitor its own state. Consciousness in this view is self-monitoring, the mind tracking its own activity. That tracking is what produces the experience. Without that second layer, the first layer stays unconscious, the same way most of your brain's processing already runs right now without you noticing any of it. This theory connects directly to animal consciousness and to artificial intelligence. If self-monitoring is what creates consciousness, then any system capable of representing its own internal states, biological or artificial, would satisfy the theory's core requirement.
Number 7. Quantum consciousness, or consciousness from the fabric of space-time. Physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff built this theory starting in the 1990s. Their claim is direct. Classical neuroscience cannot explain consciousness. The answer lies in quantum mechanics, specifically inside microtubules, tiny protein structures found in every neuron. Quantum superpositions form inside these microtubules, they argue. Consciousness happens at the exact moment those superpositions collapse. Penrose calls this objective reduction. He ties it directly to the fundamental geometry of space-time itself, not ordinary environmental interference, something deeper. Their evidence? General anesthetics reliably erase consciousness, and they appear to bind specifically inside microtubules. Some lab studies have reported unusually long-lived quantum vibrations inside microtubule structures, energy transfer effects lasting longer than expected. The theory remains deeply controversial. A major 2014 critique led by researcher Jeffrey Reimers argued something simple. The inside of a living neuron is warm, wet, noisy. Any meaningful quantum coherence should collapse almost instantly, far faster than the theory requires. Penrose and Hameroff have revised and defended the model since. As recently as 2025, some researchers are still testing microtubule quantum effects in the lab, but this remains a minority position in neuroscience. Number 6. Panpsychism. Consciousness is everywhere, in everything. This theory makes a bold claim. Consciousness is not something complex brains produce. It is a fundamental property of matter itself, present in some minimal form in every physical thing in the universe, down to individual particles. A single electron, under this view, has some unimaginably simple form of experience. Nothing like human consciousness. No thoughts, no memory, no self-awareness, just some faint trace of something. Complex consciousness, your consciousness, would then come from combining vast numbers of these simple experiences, organizing them into something far richer. Philosopher Galen Strawson has argued panpsychism solves something physicalism cannot. How could experience ever emerge from matter that has zero experience to begin with? No arrangement of non-experiential particles seems capable, even in principle, of producing experience out of absolute nothing. If some minimal experience already exists at the most basic level, complex consciousness becomes a matter of combination, not a leap from nothing into something. The hardest problem facing this theory is called the combination problem. How do billions of tiny separate micro-experiences combine into one single unified experience, the experience of being you?
Number 5. Dualism. Mind and body are two different substances entirely. René Descartes made this argument famous in the 17th century. Mind and body, he claimed, are two completely different kinds of thing. The body is physical, extended in space, governed by physical laws. The mind or soul is something else entirely, non-physical, not made of matter, not reducible to brain activity. Under this view, the brain may be necessary for ordinary conscious experience in this life. It acts as the instrument the mind uses to interact with the physical world, but the mind itself is not the brain, and it does not, in principle, depend on the brain to exist. This theory directly explains why consciousness feels nothing like ordinary matter. Under dualism, it simply is not made of ordinary matter. The problem, debated since Descartes' own time, is called the interaction problem. If mind and body are genuinely different substances, how does a non-physical mind push on a physical brain? How does a physical blow to the head affect something non-physical? Nobody has solved this cleanly, not in over 300 years.
Number 4. Illusionism. Consciousness as you imagine it does not exist. This is the most radical theory on this list. Illusionism does not try to explain how physical processes create subjective experience. It argues the entire premise is wrong. The deep, irreducible feeling the hard problem assumes exists, it does not actually exist. It is a cognitive illusion, generated by the brain. Philosopher Keith Frankish defends this position. The brain represents its own internal states to itself, he argues, in a way that makes those states seem to have a special, irreducible quality, the redness of red, the pain of pain. But that apparent quality is just another functional representation, not evidence of anything non-physical happening underneath. The real scientific job under illusionism is not explaining how the brain produces real subjective experience. It is explaining why the brain so convincingly generates the illusion that it does. Critics, including many physicalists, say this does not solve the hard problem. It declares it a category error and walks away from it. The feeling of experience itself, they argue, whatever you choose to call it, still demands an explanation, not a dismissal. Number 3. The Abrahamic Soul, a divinely created eternal self. Across Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, consciousness is understood differently than in any scientific theory on this list. It resides in a soul, distinct from the body, created directly by God. In Christianity, the soul is immortal, created individually for each person. It is the seat of consciousness. It survives the death of the body. Its fate is tied to salvation and an eternal existence in God's presence. In Islam, 2 terms describe this: Ruh, the divine spirit, breathed into the body at creation, and Nafs, the personal self, shaped through a person's life. Together, they describe a conscious self that originates directly from God, not from biological matter alone. Under these frameworks, consciousness is not an accident of complex physical organization. It is granted, intentionally, to each person, as a fundamental non-physical part of who they are, present from the very beginning, and, in most interpretations within these traditions, surviving the body completely. Number 2. Atman and Brahman. Your consciousness is the universe's consciousness. Hindu philosophy, particularly the Vedanta schools, describes individual consciousness with one word: Atman, the innermost self, the essence of a person. The relationship between Atman and Brahman, the ultimate reality underlying the entire universe, is read differently across different schools. Advaita Vedanta is non-dualist. It holds that Atman and Brahman are one and the same thing. The apparent separation between your consciousness and the consciousness underlying the whole universe is, at the deepest level, an illusion, something to see through. Liberation, moksha, means realizing that underlying unity directly. Dvaita Vedanta takes the opposite position, dualist. The individual soul and the supreme self remain genuinely separate, even within a state of ultimate liberation, even in eternal closeness to the divine. Either way, under this framework, your individual consciousness is not something the brain produces alone, sealed off by itself. It is a localized expression, a temporary individuated piece of one single, more fundamental consciousness pervading the entire universe. Number 1. Anatta. The self you think you have does not exist. Buddhism inverts the Hindu framework it historically grew out of. The doctrine of anatta, non-self, makes a direct claim. There is no permanent, unchanging soul underneath conscious experience, not a divinely created soul, not an eternal Atman fused to a universal Brahman, nothing fixed at all. What you experience as a single continuous self is actually a constantly shifting collection, 5 aggregates, called the skandhas: physical form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness itself. They arise, they pass away, moment to moment, depending on each other, with no fixed core holding them together underneath. Consciousness in this view is real, as a momentary arising thing, but the feeling of being one continuous self, the I that owns all your experiences, is itself considered a deeply ingrained illusion, a mistaken construction. Seeing through it directly through sustained meditation is central to liberation from suffering in Buddhist practice. 11 theories. A purely physical brain process, nothing more. A spotlight of attention broadcasting across a global workspace. A mathematical quantity measurable even in a sleeping brain. A mind that becomes conscious only by watching itself. A quantum collapse happening inside the geometry of space-time, inside microscopic tubes, inside your own neurons. A property woven into every particle in the universe, combining upward into the experience of being you. A separate non-physical substance entirely distinct from matter. An elaborate illusion the brain tells itself with nothing irreducible underneath. A soul created individually and eternally by God. A singular spark identical to one universal consciousness underlying everything. And the position that the self having any of these experiences was never really there to begin with. Neuroscientists disagree. Physicists disagree. Philosophers disagree. Theologians across entirely different traditions disagree with each other and within their own traditions. The thing producing the experience of hearing this sentence right now is one of the only mysteries in existence that every single human who has ever lived has personally encountered. Not one of them has fully explained it. Subscribe to Cosmic Hives. See you in the next one.